Hey there, this is Ryan Clancy, Chief Strategist for No Labels. Here for another edition of No Labels Talks with Holly Page, our No Labels co-founder. Holly, how you doing?
I'm great, Ryan. Thank you for moderating a terrific session that our listeners will get in just a minute. I'm so impressed with the caliber of people that our network continues to be able to pull in to have really candid conversations with us.
Yes, this is somebody from the RAND Corporation who just wrote a 120-word paper or 120-page paper on the sources of natural renewal. But in a lot of ways, it was about the sources of American decline and how we're dangerously getting to that point. Of course, I could probably do a one-page report on the evidence of American decline, and it would just be a picture of Marjorie Taylor Greene. I would say this person is in Congress. That's pretty much all the evidence you need to know that we're not headed in the right direction.
Exactly. Having just listened to the conversation, I thought it was an incredible articulation of why there has to be a no labels and what it is that we are in business to push against on many levels.
Yeah. I mean, our speaker talked about, I mean, they studied all the way back to the Roman Empire, looking at what happened to countries when things went wrong. What were some of the common things that you would see? And, unfortunately, look, some of the things you see today, excessive debt, political polarization, dysfunctional bureaucracies, you see obviously a lot of that today. Though I guess the good thing was, in the end, our speaker didn't think we were destined to go the way some of these other countries have gone. He thought that we had enough inherent strengths to pull out of this.
Well, I when I read the David Ignatius piece on this report from RAND a week or so ago, they did mention the progressive movement as an example of when in our own country things were going bad and a group of people got together to basically modernize and update society and government. And I know in my conversations with people around the country, I use that as an example of how citizen leaders, which we are, not necessarily anybody in sitting political office, can come together and change the course of the country. And I think it's a terrific model for us to keep in mind.
Well, the other thing he mentioned, and the progressive example is a good example of this, is he was really counseling patience when he was talking about a lot of these reform efforts have to unfold over years, decades. Even if you look at the progressive movements, which started to bubble up in the late 1800s, wasn't until Teddy Roosevelt came along in the 1910s where some of those reforms started to filter through. So, hey, we've been at this for 14 years at No Labels. We're moving ahead of schedule.
The thing I'm concerned with, though, is that government will evolve and catch up with, maybe 2020. But the technological changes that are coming down the pike, especially in terms of AI, are unbelievable. And the implications to our society and our economy and our government are so profound. You worry about their ability, our collective ability to meet those challenges collectively.
Yeah. We don't want the government's probably preparing right now to meet the challenges of 2017.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly it. I think this reminded me a lot, this conversation, of when we had Martin Gurry on, who wrote The Revolt of the Public. There were a lot of similar themes, a public whose interaction with technology isn't reflected in how they interact with their government and why that causes frustration and lack of trust. I thought that was a really interesting point.
Well, look, we'll get right to it. Our speaker today is Dr. Mike Mazarr from the RAND Corporation. The title of this episode is Warning Signs, and everybody go ahead and enjoy. Hello, everybody. This is Ryan Clancy, Chief Strategist for No Labels, here for our latest edition of No Labels Talks with Dr. Michael Mazarr from the RAND Corporation, who recently wrote, along with some of his colleagues, a fascinating piece called The Sources of Renewed National Dynamism, which is sort of all about where America's been, where it's going. Dr. Mazarr, Michael, Thank you so much for joining us.
Sure, glad to be here.
So, Mike, I want to start with this. Look, the big gist of the piece, despite the very hopeful title, "The Sources of Renewed National Dynamism," gets dark pretty quickly, and it talks about all the ways in which America is following a well-worn path, previous countries in the past, of national decline. And you write, quote, "Recovery from significant long-term national decline is rare and difficult to detect in the historical record." So, not a really hopeful way to start, but hopefully by the end here we can get some reasons for optimism. But can you talk a little bigger picture about this paper in the broader project at RAND that it's a part of?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I will say, and as we get going, there are definitely some hopeful aspects to this. The general pattern that we're looking at in terms of long-term national decline is something that we were asking if the United States fits, and there's reasons why it doesn't, as well as why it might. So there's still reasons for optimism. The bigger study was work we did at RAND for an office in the Pentagon called the Office of Assessment. And it was a general piece of research on what makes societies competitive. We sort of asked the question, we're in this long-term rivalry with China, Russia to a degree, but China as a real big sort of muscular economic, technological competitor. And we tend to think, at least in Washington, in the national security realm, about all the things we can buy or do to compete with them in kind of individual ways. But we had this sense that history has a bigger lesson, which is that success in these kind of long-term rivalries comes from the essential character of a society. Is it strong? Is it resilient? Is it dynamic? Is it energetic? Does it generate new technologies? All those things. So the question we had was, could we identify certain qualities and characteristics of societies that reflected that? And of course, as with all of our work at RAND, we approach this in a totally nonpartisan way. This is not, and both the research and the findings were interestingly sort of all over the political map, really, just about whatever anybody's sort of ideological priors they can find. Some of the results that we found supporting, I think, some of the kind of policies and approaches that they would favor. But in that kind of nonpartisan way, we looked at history and at recent empirical evidence to say, what do societies look like that do well in these kind of long-term competitions? We came up with some general findings on that. And then this paper that we're talking about of national renewal was one of several questions we identified from that first phase that we went into more depth about. And one of those conclusions was, if you look at sort of the Ottoman Empire, the late Roman Empire, the late Italian city-states and the Renaissance, once societies start meeting certain criteria for being more slow-moving, more ossified, more unequal, a variety of the things that tend to lead to long-term decline, it's hard to pull out of that. We do not conclude that the United States is already off that cliff yet. And so this study was about how do you get to national renewal? The United States has done that in the past. Other great powers have done that in a few cases, kind of anticipating problems. So we were kind of looking for that pattern.
And Mike, how far back did you go? What was the earliest?
So ancient Rome, yeah, it was the first. I mean, and we're very clear to draw distinctions. Like some of these ancient societies are so different. So if you're looking at a quality, for example, such as diversity, which in modern societies we find is a big sort of source of strength, you find that in ancient Rome, but in very different ways. So we had to make those distinctions. But from Rome through, these Renaissance Italian city-states, Florence, Venice, and so on, up through the British Empire in the 18th, 19th centuries, to the Soviet Union, modern United States, so a whole range of cases and many more over this long historical arc.
So, like, stipulating that there are those differences, what are some of the common things that you see at a point at which there's a country that tips over from being dynamic to starting on this road to decline?
Yeah, so there's a variety of characteristics sort of, both sides of the coin when they're going well, and not just the individual characteristics, but the way they work together to create sort of a synergistic, either positive or negative aspect. So I'll give you some examples. So one of them is sort of a combination of national will and national unity. So when you have those in a good sense, they can really empower competitive energy. They empower a variety of things in a society, the economy, the military strength, all the rest. When people in a society begin to lose faith in that society, in the model that it represents, in the legitimacy of the institutions, that's one of the factors that moves in a negative direction. That sort of unity is a big deal, sort of political unity with a certain amount of pluralism and variety, but still kind of a sense of a common project. When that begins to fragment, in some cases in multi-ethnic empires, like the Roman Empire becomes, like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Ottoman. But when the political unity begins to fragment, that's a problem. One other example I'll just cite, and then we can talk about other things, is sort of a factor that's associated with decline is bureaucratic ossification. So in sort of the more dynamic periods, this is not strictly a partisan judgment, but you have more kind of bottom-up energy, more experimentation going on, less central control, less of a societal devotion to orthodoxies of various kinds. And then when you have the inverse of that, and you get really strict bureaucratic control, difficulty with innovation, the presence of a lot of sort of ideological constraints and limits, that's where. So these are three of the number of factors. And then when they all work together, right, you get this kind of negative synergy of political fragmentation and ossification, all these things. And our basic conclusion is the United States is not sort of in a tremendously terrible position relative to some of these historical cases, but there are warning signs that we're headed in that direction, which I think we'd all agree.
Well, that would probably surprise people on this call who, there's a lot of sentences that begin with "America is going to hell because," and then you fill in the blank.
Not that explicitly, but I know what you're getting at. Yeah.
But you're saying that on that slope of decline, it sounds like if we're on the front end of that, meaning we're not so far down the slope now. So why is that? I mean, most people probably think, gee, it's other than the Civil War, it's hard to imagine our political system being more dysfunctional than it is. But what is it that allows you to conclude that even though we're doing some counterproductive things, that we're not so far down the road that we can't return from it?
No, a variety of pieces of evidence. I mean, obviously, in terms of political fragmentation and ideological cleavages, that's one of the worst indicators. But, if you look at polling on a whole bunch of issues, although certain political actors there is a certain extremism in different places in American politics in a nonpartisan way. The American people have a lot of shared attitudes, still 60, 70, 80% of the American people on a lot of fundamental values and characteristics that make up the basis of national unity and national willpower. There's that. If you look at the innovation engine in the American economy, even compared with Europe, compared with Japan, even South Korea these days, a lot of evidence that there still is a tremendous amount of innovative and productive energy in the American economy in a way that wasn't true in some of these real declining countries, empires, civilizations. If you look at indicators of the beginnings of some, and maybe we'll talk about this, but the model we find in the report for national renewal is that you get a set of groups in society that begin to recognize problems and work together, elites and common people, to begin to address those. And that adds up to kind of an agenda of renewal. And you see some evidence of that in the United States in terms of, the social responsibility movement in the private sector, and concern about issues of global warming, and concern about issues of political fragmentation, a variety of glimmers of the kind of movement of renewal that you might see. There's, across a variety of economic, technological, and even in some cases political indicators, there's still a strong reservoir of national strength there. And more than enough, I think that if we can really mature some of these processes of renewal, again, in this entirely sort of nonpartisan, transpartisan way, drawing ideas from the best of Republican, Democrat, Independent, everything else into this kind of agenda, there's absolutely the opportunity to pull out of, as you rightly put, the beginnings of that slope into a better future.
You mentioned, we said this at the top, that once a country gets too far down this path, it is rare for them to turn it around. But of course, it doesn't mean they never turn it around. There are some examples where maybe surprisingly, a country was on a bit of a descent and managed to turn it around. What are your favorite examples from the historical record? What was the country? What was wrong at the time? Or what was a primary driver of their problems, and then how'd they turn it around?
So two big examples we cite are Britain in the Victorian era and the United States in what's called the progressive era, post-Gilded Age. And we call both of those examples of anticipatory renewal in the sense that things hadn't gotten tremendously miserable yet in either case, but there were problems, social, political, economic problems that were worsening. And they got this kind of renewal movement to kind of pull them out of that in a number of ways. In both cases, some of the challenges they were dealing with were rising inequality, like in the United States, the Gilded Age, of course, robber barons and all that. Political inequality. In both cases, you had situations where you did not have a complete voting rights throughout the population. You had rising environmental problems connected with early industrialization. You had worker rights issues. A variety of other things. So this whole set of very significant problems. And in each of those areas, in both cases, you have this interconnected set of, in many cases, issue-specific reform movements that advocate, and sometimes it takes decades, right? I mean, in the British case, you've got some of these problems really coming to the fore, well, even earlier, but in a really more noticeable way in the 1830s, 1840s. It's not until the 1890s that you finally get some of the real final legislation that addresses some of these things. And in the United States, you have a process that even in the 1890s, you begin to see some reaction. You have some fallback in the 1920s. And some of the later Great Society programs are still kind of the maturation of some of this thinking. So it can take decades. But in each of those cases, across this whole range of social and economic, environmental problems with kind of equality and sort of social health really at the centerpiece are the kind of issues that they addressed.
I mean, a lot of this, it sounds like, is obviously, the renewal happens from within, and there's these domestic social or political movements that serve as sources for renewal. But I'm curious if you looked at the role that tension on the international scene plays as companies or countries are trying to navigate this. Because look, even if we look at the United States today, we would have a lot of problems to deal with, even if we didn't have to worry about Iran or Russia or China. But of course, we do have to worry about all those things. In a lot of ways, that complicates everything we might want to do. So how does that historically impact a country's ability to pull itself out? I guess what I was curious about is it always a negative, or does it sometimes have a galvanizing effect?
No, absolutely. It's a great question. And I think the answer is it can have both effects. I mean, clearly it can have a galvanizing effect in some cases. I mean, some of the space race that led to a lot of technological innovations was prompted by Sputnik and the competition with the Soviet Union. And so you can have that. In other cases, two big tottering empires, the Austro-Hungarian and the Ottoman, were both sort of kicked over the ledge by World War I, by the cost, by the direct impact on their territory, by combat losses, all that kind of stuff. So I think it relates so it can have either effect, and the way that the China competition is leading to some investments in American industry and creating this sense that we need some new dynamism in certain sectors is potentially a long-term net positive. I think the challenge for us in that regard relates to another finding, which is financial overreach is a classic both symptom and cause of long-term national decline consistently across history. And when we're in a position now where our interest payments on the debt are matching our defense budget and are only going to grow over time, the ability of the United States to manage these external challenges at the same time as we are making necessary investments domestically is really under question. And so resolving that financial engine at the heart of our dynamism and competitiveness in the context of these big international demands as still the leader of the international system with the domestic stuff, I think is the biggest challenge that raises.
Hey, how does that manifest itself, though, the problem of the fiscal overhang? Because, in America, we have been hearing for a long time about the perils of debt. And until recently, nobody really had to think about any consequences of it. I mean, you could get a 3% mortgage forever, and a lot of the things you associate with sky-high debts, regular people just didn't see the consequence of it.
Yeah.
That's starting to change. At what point does it tend to become a problem that you talk about and get concerned about to, oh my God, we got to deal with this now?
No, that's a great question. And I don't, it's a hotly debated question, right? Among economists, among political scientists, and sort of the specific economic symptoms of debt. And there used to be this argument that crossing the 100% of GDP level in terms of debt was a real threshold. Well, Japan's been well over 200% for a long time. China's now well above that in terms of total, official state debt. So obviously countries, that may contribute to some level of stagnation, but you don't reach a crisis. I think the answer is it can be a problem quickly or slowly. In some cases, you can obviously have essentially a currency crisis where people lose faith in the future debt instruments, and you have a large-scale immediate crisis. For the United States, the overall strength of the economy, I think not a lot of people are expecting that anytime soon. What I'm almost more worried about is the gradual vice effect of this, where so much of what the resources the United States has that we gather in taxes that we spend are locked in various ways between entitlements and then this growing interest on the debt. And then, unless we're going to do something radical with a defense budget, the amount that's left over at the level we're willing to tax ourselves right now is shriveling. And so whether you're talking about international initiatives like foreign assistance or loans that can compete with China, if you're talking about domestic initiatives in terms of investments and everything from education to infrastructure, which we're doing a bit more of, your space for taking actions to bolster your competitiveness really narrows. And I think that gets worse over time. And of course, as your question implies, we've been ignoring it, and we've been able to ignore it because we've been spending these incredible, deficit levels. But my sense is over the next few years, increasingly that's going to bite. And that I think is the gradual slow working out of that threat.
One thing that I would suspect would surprise people to learn is we've all, of course, gotten used to these budget fights in Washington every year where, they threaten a shutdown or they have a shutdown. But for the reasons you describe, that share of the budget they're arguing over is only about 30% of the budget, which is what's called discretionary spending.
Right.
The vast majority of everything else, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, interest payments, that's on autopilot. That money is basically spoken for before they even start debating the budget. And as you know, that's just going to keep growing over time.
Yeah, exactly. And even besides interest, these other things as well. And, apart from pensions, most of the Defense Department is considered discretionary, but in a lot of ways, unless the United States is going to change its international position radically, it's not, some level of it isn't discretionary.
Yeah.
So the real amounts that and in some ways that is the pattern that you see historically. It's very different in a lot of cases when, if you look at the Spanish Empire, central governments at that time weren't really doing anything other than fighting wars and a handful of other things. They didn't have the kind of structure that we have now, but still what you see is they can pay the interest on their debt and they can fight the current war, and that's about all they can do. And so that's the, as you're saying, the discretionary ability for the United States to be a financially catalyzing its dynamism. We've got to have a national agreement that if we want our nation to be dynamic, we've got to address some of the entitlement programs. We've got to decide, if we as a nation can afford a little more tax. We've got to sort of bring this in a direction that is both sustainable and clears up a little bit more discretionary room. But it is extraordinarily difficult all across the political spectrum to do that.
I want to bring in a question. Each week when we send out a newsletter on Friday, we invite our citizen supporters to submit a question, and we certainly hope people will do that this Friday. And I want to share one we got last week when we announced that you were coming on, Mike. This is from John Grillos in Tennessee. And John asked, he said, this report is studying the relative decline of U.S. competitiveness over a stretch of time, where there's also been an unprecedented reduction of global poverty elsewhere. In no small part due to U.S.-led economic assistance. So the question is, how do we disentangle the relative decline of U.S. hegemony from the emergence of this much larger global middle class? John wants to know, could this decline we're feeling actually be seen from a different angle as a global leveling of the playing field?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And I think that sort of some degree of leveling is definitely going on. And in the long run is a good thing. I mean, it's the world we sought. It was exactly the goal of the post-war U.S. order to a significant degree. Obviously, the U.S. had its self-interest in mind too, but it wanted to create a linked international economic environment in which developing countries could rise, with the sense that that was in the U.S. self-interest in the long run, because these would be markets we could then sell to, cooperate with, and all the rest. What I would distinguish is two different kinds of decline or the need for renewal. One is what we're talking about, which is the relative U.S. position toward others. And of course, we're talking in this overall project about competition relative to China. But if you're talking about just the relative U.S. position in the world, that's one kind of relative decline. The other is the health of a society inherently. And that's really the ultimate true focus of this project is the characteristics and the metrics by which you judge. Is a great power unified? Is it coherent? Is it, politically effective? Are its institutions strong? Is it economically innovative and dynamic? All these kinds of things. When you put that together with the right approach to leadership of a shared vision of the international system, you have the best possible situation. And that power can be incredibly dynamic domestically, even as it encourages a world that is becoming more, where power is becoming more shared, if you see what I mean. And that was kind of, again, the general U.S. goal and mindset, and there were elements of that all during this period where, one thing people don't think about is that inequality within many societies, including the United States, has been rising over the last several decades. Inequality globally, as measured in terms of inequality between countries, has been declining significantly because of the rise of these emerging powers, economically relative to the United States. So basically, what the study is about is how you make your own society sustainable in order to be competitive with others that may be your rivals. The question then of where you position yourself relative to other countries, how much multipolarity you welcome, how much you want to be the leader, that's like almost a separate strategic question. And like I say, just for me personally, I think the best possible situation is domestic strength combined with inclusive international leadership. And those, a U.S. vision based on that combination is, I think, really, really sustainable.
We talked before about debt as one of the structural challenges we got to deal with. But you also write in the report, you say that the United States is not yet demonstrating widespread and shared recognition of the societal challenges or determination to reform in key issue areas. I mean, a short way to say that is we don't really even have agreement on what the problems are, let alone a way to get at a solution. So you talked about debt. What are the other key problems that leaders should be talking much more about in terms of structural issues we've got to get a handle on to arrest this decline?
So one that, I mean, there's things, you know, and of course, when you do polling of Americans and ask what are your top 10 issues, a lot of sort of things crop up that we would all think about. One thing that came out in another one of our second phase reports in this project that I'd really stress that I think needs a lot more discussion is kind of the health of governance in the United States and innovative models for governance. So one of the big problems, obviously, is that Americans across the political spectrum, for a variety of reasons, have kind of lost faith in a lot of the institutions in our society, leading with, you know, Congress, executive branch institutions, those kinds of things. There's a strong perception grounded in a certain degree of reality that the level of effectiveness of those institutions has really been decaying. And one of the arguments we made was the coming strategic era is about, for example, emerging technologies. It's an era when you got to do well in AI and a variety of associated biotechnology and other kinds of leading edge frontier technologies in order to be competitive. But in order for that to work and everything else, a big lesson of history is that the leading countries at any moment are those with the strongest, most effective political and other governance institutions. And this gets to this issue of bureaucracy and ossification. And there's sort of, I think, a growing set of folks who are focused on this as a challenge and an opportunity. Like what would a set of experiments look like across the country? And of course, a lot of governors, Republicans, Democrats are working on this. But what would it look like for the United States to enter an era of political experimentation with new forms of governance? How do we run these things to get out of this overbearing bureaucratic approach to so many things in government, but also in the private sector? What would it look like to have more empowering sorts of institutions that Americans interact with? That I think is something where reform is going to be needed if the legitimacy of these institutions is to be recaptured. And we see only the barest beginning of that dialogue. There's a lot of frustration with existing institutions for sure. And I think there's a lot of people that will say, you know, again, across the political spectrum, hey, this stuff is not working. But taking the next step and saying, okay, well, what would a reform process look like? How would we begin to prompt this kind of experimentation, grassroots experimentation and new ways of governance? I think that's a critical example of what you're talking about.
Well, we're lucky we're set up for that. There's a reason they call states the laboratories of democracy.
Exactly.
Right? But what about, you know, you mentioned the collapse of trust and faith in institutions. And I mean, this is an instance where if you look at the polling, it really is just a continuous descent for like 50 years. There's that classic question I think Gallup has been asking, which is, do you trust government to do the right thing most of the time? As unbelievable as it is to think, there was a time where that was in the 60s and 70s. And I mean, now it's like a single digit number. But there's other, you know, people don't trust the media. They don't trust business. The only institution that I think is still majority admired by the public is the military and small businesses.
Yeah.
I mean, is there any precedent for that turning around? Like once the public loses the faith that much in an institution, I mean, can that faith be restored?
Well, you know,
without that institution being blown up entirely and replaced with something new?
That's $1 million question. I mean, there are scholars. There's a guy, for example, named Walter Scheidel, who writes really interestingly about the history of inequality. And his argument is, as he looks at these historical patterns, what tends to happen is a narrowing of power on elites whose the institutions they represent become less and less credible and authentic and legitimate. And the only thing that snaps countries out of that is like a war or a revolution or an asteroid. That'd be something very, very big. I think we do see examples. One of the reasons it's hard to make comparisons is we don't have the same polling evidence from these earlier times, right? So we don't know In these examples we gave of Victorian England and Gilded Age America, there was a lot of disaffection with American institutions. Was it at the same level? We can't know, maybe not by polling, but there was a real sense that if action wasn't taken, that these were socio-political models that were going to become more and more kind of illegitimate and lose support. So, that combined with some countervailing polling of Americans in terms of, the values that they still share. And as you know, I mean, this tends to be the further away from you these institutions are, the less faith you have. When you ask people, do they like their representative, Republican, Democrat, whoever, the numbers are much higher than the general numbers. Do they have faith in some of their local things? So part of this gets back to the governance reform and finding ways to get sort of the governance processes of society more connected. I'll just say one quickly, these are all incredibly complex trends, right? And this is also connected to the change in the information environment in which we're living, right? There's some very interesting research about how the corruption of the public sphere and the fragmentation of the sources of information people have also contributes to the loss of legitimacy, because it used to be, if 60% of Americans are listening to Walter Cronkite, that tends to create a sense that there are these legitimating institutions, media and otherwise, that are kind of mediating our republic. But then when it becomes fragmented, you get a lot wider range of views, but it also tends to fragment the sense of legitimacy of those few institutions. So there's a lot of things going on. I continue to believe that there's some historical evidence. There's evidence in polling of Americans. There's evidence in the performance of some institutions that the basis for renewal continues to be there. If we have the right political and other leadership, the basis is there. There are ideas on both sides, all sides of the political spectrum, to draw from to make this not a partisan or ideological agenda. I really believe it's true that we haven't crossed that threshold yet. The question is whether we get enough of the leadership.
We don't have much time left, and but I guess I want to close with this: is if you were to paint the optimistic picture, for how this gets better, I mean, does it look like the late 1800s, early 1900s, where you had this situation where, as you noted, just as now, you had this situation where you had what you could call some green shoots, some civil society groups and others starting to build these reforms, and then it bubbles up, and then you get Teddy Roosevelt in a burst of actual legislative reform, a different kind of leadership.
Right.
Is that the optimistic case for America, that some of these different efforts are afoot? We're still waiting for a political leader or a political movement to kind of coalesce those things into a bit of a renewal agenda? Is that what it looks like, or is it going to look different?
So I don't know. We can't be sure exactly how it's going to look. It's a very different, social informational environment than at those times. But the argument we make in this paper is, it could look something like that. And we do see some of those green shoots. I mean, the, corporate social responsibility movement and other things in the private sector, where you had some leading private sector representative associations kind of start moving away from the extreme shareholder model to say, hey, look, we got to get back to the view of most American business leaders in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and to some extent earlier, that businesses have more responsibilities in the national and local community than just maximizing share price. That agenda is wobbling a little bit, but it's there. And there's a lot of, you have the patriotic millionaires movement, you have a variety of these things where you do see some evidence. And in some other issue areas, you see similar things. There's not enough of a critical mass yet. I would argue we don't see enough of what we would describe as our elites in the private sector and elsewhere really leaning into this. As you said before, there's not yet a consensus recognition. One of the things is some of those earlier issues were a little simpler. Like when you were talking about expanding the voting franchise, then we have to expand it to all Americans. And that's a binary issue. It's pretty straightforward. If you're talking about, the debt or immigration or things like that today, they're much more complex issues. And there's not yet a shared understanding that there is a singular problem and there's some reasonably clear solutions. But I do think that there is enough of a bipartisan agreement on some areas of potential progress in a number of these places. You've seen some green shoots, but I tell you, I'm agnostic, about where we will head, because as much as there is that optimistic foundation, there still isn't the critical mass of understanding of some issues, or shared understanding of leadership, of elite commitment. So I think, the big question over the next several years is whether we see more of that.
Mike, I know Rand Corporation, ruthlessly non-political.
Yeah.
I will respect that. But I do want to ask, I mean, when you look at the 2024 presidential debate as it stands today, I don't want you to make a judgment on the respective candidates, but I would like you to comment on whether some of the issues being discussed, do you see discussion of some of these elements of national renewal out there, or are we kind of missing the boat as it relates to the things our political leaders really should be talking about?
Yeah.
If we wanted to stem this decline that you've identified.
Well, it's, so as you say, I mean, Rand is entirely nonpartisan. We never, weigh in favor of a political party of any kind. And I hate to say, well, it's hard to say, like, I want to answer your question just simply, but, one part of the answer is absolutely, I see it on the part of some political actors in some places. Like you said, the laboratories of democracy, you can find Republican and Democratic governors that are doing some really interesting things, trying to address some of these issues. At the national level, there are absolutely members of Congress on both sides of the aisle and independents you can point to, and many of them trying to work with each other to achieve certain things on certain key issues, whether it's domestic economic and technological innovation, or immigration, or a variety of other issues. Among the American people, you can see the polling evidence that, again, 60 or 70% of them agree with certain kind of pragmatic, middle-of-the-road solutions to certain things. So you can point to a lot of evidence that the answer to your question is yes, there are political leaders that are addressing the right issues and trying to do so in a thoughtful and effective way. That kind of commitment is captured or exists in this larger cloud of shouting and part of the problem is, where does the media attention go, and what do they report on, and what do they emphasize, as opposed to what some of the political leaders are trying to do. Like 20 years ago, I wrote a piece about what I called the pessimism syndrome, and that evidence is very clear today, that you can document that a significant majority of major media stories have a negative slant. Something is going wrong. There is a problem. Someone is doing something wrong. And you can also document that the American people, by polling, believe that the condition of many issues is way worse than it actually is.
Right.
In the 90s, if you asked people, a third of Americans thought that unemployment was at Great Depression levels during the biggest economic boom we had since the 50s or 60s. Today, Americans typically believe crime is a lot worse than it is. So the media has an effect here in driving a political environment that is not necessarily welcoming to the efforts of those who are trying to make a difference. So I think the answer to your question is, there are political actors across the spectrum who are trying to respond positively to the kind of question you're asking. But it is nested in this larger, bitter ideological debate, strong cleavages, the evidence we cite that, Americans of different parties see each other increasingly as enemies rather than just as somebody who has a different view. Certain political leaders who are, on the fringes of American politics. So it's a contest between those two things. Part of my ultimate optimism is, I think the vast majority of the American people want the positive movement on these issues that certain political actors and others are trying to bring to us across the spectrum. And, whether that view ultimately comes about. Again, the basic message of this work is that the potential for renewal is there. If we expand off some positive things that are going on, really lean into this in the next 5 to 10 years, we can have another example of this kind of anticipatory renewal that we've seen in history. Because as you said before, we're not so far down that slope that we can't get it back. Whether it happens, I can't predict.
Well, look, Mike, we agree with you that the vast majority of people do want this constructive change. That's the reason No Labels has been doing what we've been doing for 14 years, and we're going to keep doing it. Look, Mike, I want to thank you so much for joining us, coming here to talk about this new report, the Sources of Renewed National Dynamism, which you can actually find on Rand's website. It's a great piece. It's gotten a lot of attention. David Ignatius, the foreign policy columnist for the Washington Post, wrote about it. And so, Mike, we really appreciate you offering your thoughts with us today.
Sure thing. Really great to join you.
And thank you, everybody, for joining No Labels Talks, and we hope to see you again next week.